There is a question that textbooks answer in 2 lines and documentaries ignore in 40 minutes. Why did it go to Germany? Among all the nations of Europe, among all the countries of the planet with historical grudges, accumulated humiliations, devastating economic crises, why was it precisely Germany that launched the world into the deadliest war in history? Why was it the German people who tolerated, applauded, and in many cases facilitated the most destructive machinery that human beings have ever set in motion? The easy answer is Adolf Hitler. The answer they give you at school, in movies, in museums. A bad man, a monster, an accident of history that took hold of a normal nation and made it unrecognizable. But that answer is incomplete. And in its incompleteness, it hides something more disturbing than the story of the monster. It hides the story of how a modern, cultured, industrialized society with world-renowned universities and one of the richest philosophical traditions in the West chose, with its own hands at the ballot box and in the streets, the path to the abyss. This is that story. From the trenches of Verdun to the halls of the Reichstag, from the hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of a generation to the 5 million votes that the Nazi Party obtained in September 1930. From the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich to the office of President Paul von Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933. No demon descends from the clouds. Demons are built. This is the story of how one was built. The German Empire was born in blood and steel, and that marked everything that came after. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, as a symbol of French greatness, King William I of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser of the new unified German Empire. The choice of the setting was deliberate. France had just been crushed militarily. Alsace and Lorraine, 2 French provinces with coal mines and textile factories, passed into German hands. The humiliation was total. The architect of this unification was Otto von Bismarck, who on the same day became the first Chancellor of the Reich. Bismarck had put it bluntly in 1862. The great questions of the age are not decided by speeches and resolutions of the majority. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. And he proved it 3 times, in 1864 against Denmark, in 1866 against Austria, in 1870 against France. 3 wars in 6 years, 3 victories. The new German Reich emerged not as the result of a democratic revolution, but as a product of military force. This origin had consequences that were projected for decades. The army in Germany was not an institution of the state. It was, according to Richard J. Evans in The Coming of the Third Reich, almost a state within the state. Their budgets were approved every 7 years, not every year. The Minister of War was responsible to the army, not to Parliament. Officers enjoyed social privileges and the automatic deference of civilians. In times of emergency, the army could declare martial law and suspend civil liberties. And the German army had experience with genocide long before 1939. Between 1904 and 1907, in German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, imperial troops crushed a rebellion of the Herero people with systematic ferocity. From a population of approximately 80,000 people before the conflict, the Herero were reduced to about 15,000 by 1911. Men, women, and children were massacred or driven into the desert, where they died of thirst and starvation. It was the first documented genocide of the 20th century, and those who perpetrated it wore German uniforms. In Alsace-Lorraine, German soldiers treated the inhabitants as a conquered and hostile population. In 1913, the army's excesses in that region provoked a vote of no confidence in the Reichstag, a gesture that the government ignored with complete impunity because the government was answerable not to Parliament, but to the Kaiser. Bismarck also left another toxic legacy: the politics of internal enemies. In the 1870s, he launched the Kulturkampf, a fierce campaign against the Catholic Church, with police arresting priests and bishops being deposed. When that war ended, without having achieved its objectives, he attacked the socialists with the anti-socialist law of 1878, which banned meetings, newspapers, and the organization of the Social Democratic Party itself, prison sentences for those who criticized the monarch or state officials, and the most revealing fact, the German liberals supported these measures, convinced that Catholicism and socialism were such serious threats to civilization that they justified the abandonment of all its principles. The lesson was engraved in German political culture. It is legitimate to destroy the enemy within. It is patriotic to do so, and there is always an internal enemy available. By 1914, Germany was the most dynamic industrial power in Europe, with the largest rail network on the continent, a navy challenging British supremacy, and an army of more than 4 million trained men. It was also a country with one of the largest workers' organizations on the planet. The Social Democratic Party had more than 1 million members on the eve of the war, and a growing middle class that looked to the future with ambition and a certain pride. But beneath that modern surface was something profoundly unstable. A political system in which Parliament did not really control the government, in which the army operated with almost complete autonomy, and in which the idea that problems could be solved by force and the elimination of the adversary was naturally accepted by the elites and part of the people. That country went to war in August 1914, and 4 years later, he came out of it unrecognizable. The enthusiasm of August 2nd, 1914 in German cities was genuine. Adolf Hitler, a young Austrian with no job or purpose who made a living in Munich drawing watercolors of buildings, appears in a photograph taken that day at the Odeonsplatz. His face glows with excitement. 3 days later, he enlisted in the Bavarian army. In his autobiography, he described that moment as a relief from the painful emotions of my youth. For the first time, I had a mission. For the first time, I belonged to something. 4.5 years of total war changed everything. The Germans fought on 2 fronts simultaneously, consuming men, resources, and hopes at a speed that no economy could sustain indefinitely. The British naval blockade cut off German access to raw materials and food. By 1918, the average diet of a German civilian was less than 1,000 calories a day. Between 400,000 and 700,000 German civilians died of starvation and malnutrition-related diseases during the blockade. Estimates vary, but hunger was real and everywhere, and yet the German army continued to fight. On the Western Front, on French and Belgian soil, not on German soil. By the autumn of 1918, Erich Ludendorff's spring offensive, which had concentrated divisions moved from the Eastern Front after the Russian surrender, had run its course. The Allied counterattack gained ground week by week. On September 28th, Ludendorff informed the Kaiser the war was lost. An armistice had to be requested. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. On the same day, Philipp Scheidemann, a leader of the Social Democratic Party, proclaimed the German Republic from a window in the Reichstag, off the cuff without consulting anyone, to win the race against the communist Spartacists who wanted to proclaim a Soviet republic. Friedrich Ebert, the new chancellor, received the news with irritation. Who gave you authority for that? On November 11th, at 11 o'clock in the morning of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice went into effect. The cannons fell silent. The German troops were in Belgium, in France, in northern Russia. The army had not been defeated on German soil. There was not a single Allied soldier within the borders of the Reich. That seemingly technical detail was going to prove catastrophic. When the troops began to return to German cities, on December 10, 1918, Ebert himself went out to meet them in Berlin. No enemy has defeated you, he told them. It was a phrase designed to maintain morale, but it became the foundation of a devastating myth. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, hero of the Battle of Tannenberg 71, the personification of old Prussian Germany, and General Erich Ludendorff, began to propagate the legend. The German army had been the victim of a secret and planned demagogic campaign that had destroyed all its heroic efforts. Kaiser Wilhelm II, already in exile in Holland, repeated it in his memoirs. During 4.5 years of unprecedented brilliant victories, he was forced to collapse by the stab in the back at the moment when peace was within reach. The Dolchstoß, the stab in the back. A lie carefully fabricated by the same generals who had asked for the armistice. Ludendorff had calculated that if the politicians signed the surrender, the responsibility would fall on them, not on the army. He achieved it with total success. Who had given that stab? The socialists, the communists, the Jews, the same ones who now governed the Republic, the November criminals, as they were called in the jargon of the extreme right. Hitler was in a military hospital in Passewalk in Pomerania, recovering from a mustard gas wound that had left him temporarily blind when he learned of the armistice. "Everything turned black before my eyes," he later wrote. "I staggered into my bedroom and threw myself on the bed." And at that moment, in his own words, he decided to enter politics. For him, as for millions of Germans, the defeat had no rational explanation. He only had the supernatural: betrayal. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the German delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles in the same Hall of Mirrors, where 48 years earlier the Empire had been proclaimed. The choice of the place was French. Humiliation was the message. The terms were harsh. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The north of Schleswig went to Denmark. Posen and most of West Prussia, including a land corridor that now separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, went to the new Poland. Danzig became a free city under the mandate of the newly created League of Nations. The German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were redistributed as mandates among the victorious powers. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. Tanks, heavy artillery, and compulsory military service are prohibited. Germany could not have an air force. The navy was dismantled and its large ships handed over to the Allies. But what hurt most, as described by Richard Evans, was not the territory or the military boundaries. It was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the start of the war. On that basis, financial reparations were justified, the obligation to pay for decades in gold for the damage caused. The prohibition of union with Austria was seen as the most flagrant injustice. The 6 million German-speaking Austrians wanted to join the Reich. The principle of national self-determination that US President Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed in his 14 points applied to Poles, Czechs, and Yugoslavs did not apply to the Germans. The government of the new German Republic found itself in a desperate position: sign or face a resumption of hostilities. Philipp Scheidemann, the first Chancellor of the Republic, preferred to resign rather than do so. "What hand would not dry up that locks itself up and puts these chains on us?" she said in her resignation speech. His successor, Gustav Bauer, signed. The feeling was one of disbelief and fury. Germany had hoped that since the Allied troops had not set foot on German soil, the terms of peace would be relatively equal. That was a colossal miscalculation. The French, who had suffered 4 years of German occupation of their own territory and whose northern industry had been systematically dismantled by the German army, factories dismantled piece by piece, railways torn from their tracks, were in no mood to show generosity. But that was impossible to explain in Germany in 1919. What remained was the certainty that the Treaty of Versailles was a peace dictated, an unjust humiliation, a condemnation based on lies. And that certainty united the right, the centre, and much of the moderate German left in a resentment that the new democratic republic could never exercise because it itself had signed that treaty. Those who signed it would be called the criminals of November. His crime was to have accepted defeat, and that guilt would become the most powerful political ammunition of the Republic during its 14 years of life. The Weimar Republic, so called because its constitution was drafted in that city of Thuringia, the seat of Goethe and Schiller, far from the convulsed Berlin, was born in circumstances that condemned it to failure almost from the outset. Its founders were called criminals for having signed the peace. Its institutions had been built in days, on the rubble of an imperial system that had lasted 50 years. Their first governments inherited a defeated army, an economy shattered by 4 years of blockade, colossal war debts, and a political class with no experience of real government, because under the Kaiser, the ministers were officials appointed by the monarch, not politicians responsible to Parliament. Between February 13, 1919 and January 30, 1933, the Weimar Republic had 14 different chancelleries. 14 in 14 years, an average of 11 months per government. The instability was not an accident, it was structural. The system of pure proportional representation made it almost impossible for any party to obtain an absolute majority. Coalition governments were formed and collapsed with a frequency that destroyed any coherence in economic or foreign policy. And the Republic had fierce enemies from all sides. On the left, the communists of the KPD, the German Communist Party, considered that the November Revolution had been a fraud, a missed opportunity, and that the bourgeois republic must be overthrown in order to install a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat. In January 1919, the Spartacists, the faction led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, launched an armed uprising in Berlin. Ebert's social democratic government crushed it by employing the Freikorps, paramilitary units of deeply anti-democratic war veterans. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were assassinated on January 15, 1919. Their bodies were found on Berlin's Landwehr Canal. On the right, the Kapp Putsch of March 1920. Freikorps units marched on Berlin and took the city as the government fled to Stuttgart. The Reich did not have the strength to suppress them. General Hans von Seeckt, head of the army, refused to order the Reichswehr to fire on other German soldiers. What ended with the coup was a general strike of the unions. But the fact that the military had remained neutral in the face of an attempt to overthrow the democratic government said all there was to know about the military's loyalty to the Republic. That disloyalty of the institutions was the deepest poison. Judges who came from the imperial era applied symbolic penalties to far-right criminals and severe penalties to left-wing militants. The officials who had served the Kaiser remained in their posts. The army was secretly organized to violate the restrictions of Versailles, training in the Soviet Union, in a historical paradox of extraordinary dimensions, with the tacit consent of a government that looked the other way. The right-wing press, the officers' clubs, the student fraternities, they all constructed a discourse in which the Republic was illegitimate, in which its founders were traitors, in which Germany deserved something more worthy than this. The myth of the Dolchstoß was repeated in thousands of speeches, articles, and books. No one was punished for spreading it. The German courts considered it simply a legitimate political opinion, and culture, meanwhile, explored territories that old Germany had never tolerated. Berlin in the 1920s was a city of cabaret and expressionism, of jazz and avant-garde cinematography, of satirical magazines and gay rights organizations. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, funded by the Prussian government from 1919, publicly advocated the abolition of paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexual relations. Marlene Dietrich acted in The Blue Angel. Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill premiered The Threepenny Opera in 1928. For millions of middle-class Germans, teachers, clerks, small merchants, former officers, all this was proof of deliberate decline. Modernity was foreign and threatening to them. Order, purity, honor. Those words that the imperial army had taught them to venerate, where were they now? In that vacuum, someone was going to show up with answers. Adolf Hitler arrived in Munich in May 1913 at the age of 24, with 183 Austrian crowns in his pocket and without any concrete plan for his life. He was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn on the Austro-German border. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official. His mother, Clara, died of breast cancer in December 1907, when Adolf was 18. The doctor who treated her to the end, who treated her with a dedication that he himself acknowledged, was a Jewish doctor named Eduard Bloch. Hitler had twice failed the entrance examination to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He lived for 3 years in homeless shelters, selling watercolors of buildings to merchants, some of them Jewish, to survive. In Vienna, he absorbed the pan-Germanism of Georg von Schönerer and the populist anti-Semitism of Mayor Karl Löger. The mixture, which also included Richard Wagner, whose operas he saw hundreds of times, left him with a vision of the world in which race-determined destiny and Jews were the cause of all evil. But in 1913, according to Ian Kershaw's assessment in his biography Hitler, this anti-Semitism still had an abstract, almost theoretical quality. His hatred had not become visceral, personal, and extreme. That happened at the end of World War I. Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian army on August 16, 1914. No one checked whether he was a German citizen because he was not, and spent 4 years on the Western Front as Meldegänger, a regimental messenger. He was wounded, decorated twice, reached the rank of corporal. He won the Iron Cross First Class thanks, paradoxically, to the recommendation of a Jewish officer. He was a competent soldier, but without anything it would take to be an officer, he did not know how to command. His comrades remembered him as someone who discussed politics in the trenches when others preferred to talk about women. When news of the armistice reached the hospital in Passewalk, Hitler made a decision. All his previous failures, artistic, social, economic, were redeemed because he had fought for Germany. And Germany had been betrayed. He knew it. Now he also knew what he had to do. In June 1919, the Bavarian army sent him to a political training course to cleanse the troops of possible communist sympathies. There he discovered that he had an extraordinary talent for public speaking. He was sent to guard a small political organization, the German Workers' Party, founded on January 5, 1919, by Anton Drexler, a locksmith. Hitler attended a meeting of 25 people in the basement of a beer hall, took the floor on his own when he heard something he disagreed with, and spoke for 30 minutes. Drexler, astonished, handed him a note. "You have the power to speak, man." In September 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party with membership number 555. The party numbered from 500 to give the impression of being bigger. It actually had less than 60 members. In February 1920, the party changed its name. National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In July 1921, Hitler became its president with dictatorial powers. He was 32 years old and had an organization with several thousand members, a newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, the Racial Observer, and a shock corps, the Assault Section, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Brown Shirts. And Munich in those years was the perfect place for someone like him. The Bavarian government was deeply conservative, hostile to the Social Democratic Republic in Berlin, full of officials who viewed Hitler with sympathy or at least indulgence. Bavarian judges acquitted or imposed minimum sentences on violent far-right perpetrators. The police looked the other way when the Brown Shirts broke up the meetings of political opponents with blows. Hitler learned from the socialists how to mobilize the masses. He learned from the Italian fascists that power had to be seized by force if necessary. And he learned from his own experience that charisma, obsessive repetition, and strategic violence could build a power base from scratch. What was missing was a crisis big enough for that power to become irresistible. The crisis came in 1923. The year 1923 was the most chaotic in the already chaotic history of the Weimar Republic, and it was the year in which Adolf Hitler tried everything and failed in a way that, paradoxically, provided him with exactly what he needed. The origin of the crisis was in war reparations. Germany had defaulted on its payments in coal and timber to France and Belgium. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the region of coal mines, steel mills and factories that produced 70 to 80% of the country's coal and steel. The government of Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno responded by calling for passive resistance. The Ruhr workers had to strike, the government would pay for them. To pay for them, the Reichsbank printed money. That decision triggered the greatest hyperinflation in modern history. In January 1923, buying a dollar cost more than 17,000 marks. In April, 24,000. In July, 353,000. In August, 4,621,000. In September, 98,860,000. In October, 25,260,000,000. In November 1923, at the height of hyperinflation, the exchange rate reached 2,193,600,000,000 marks to the dollar. More than 2 trillion marks per dollar. Victor Klemperer, a German Jewish academic and writer who left a meticulous diary of those years, described how, in the summer of 1923, despite receiving almost 1,000,000 marks in salary by the end of May, he was still unable to pay his gas bills and taxes. A cup of coffee that cost 5,000 marks when sitting in a cafe could be worth 8,000 when the bill came in an hour later. A kilogram of rye bread, the staple of the German diet, cost 163 marks on January 3, 1923, 9 million marks on October 1st, 78 billion on November 5th, and 233 billion on November 19th. Foreign correspondents described how prices changed every hour in stores. A gramophone cost 5 million marks at 10 in the morning and 12 million at 3 in the afternoon. Employees were paid in wheelbarrows or shopping baskets because the number of bills needed was too large to fit in purses or pockets. Municipalities began printing their own emergency money. Printers could not keep up with the production of banknotes of increasingly astronomical denominations. For Germany's middle class, teachers, employees, pensioners, small business owners, hyperinflation was a generational catastrophe. The savings accumulated over decades evaporated within weeks. The mortgages, expressed in marks, were extinguished, which benefited the debtors. But savers lost everything. A man who had set aside money for 40 years for his retirement found that his savings were literally worth less than the paper on which they were printed. Those who gained from hyperinflation were those who had debts and real assets, large industrialists, speculators, some farmers. The distribution of wealth was brutally redistributed from the middle class to the rich, and the German middle class, already resentful of Versailles, now distrustful of the Republic, learned a lesson it would never forget. Weimar democracy destroyed its savings. Weimar democracy was his enemy. In this context, November 1923 arrived. Hitler, now backed by General Erich Ludendorff, the same one who had directed German military strategy during the war, decided that it was time to seize power by force. The model was Mussolini, who in October 1922 had marched on Rome in his black shirts and obtained the government of Italy. But Hitler did not have the support of the regular army, nor the complicity of the national government, nor even the certainty that the Bavarian government would follow him. On November 8, 1923, Hitler, armed with a group of men, stormed the Bürgerbräukeller, a large beer hall on the outskirts of central Munich, where State Commissar General Gustav von Kahr was conducting a political rally in front of about 3,000 attendees. Hitler fired a shot at the ceiling to silence the crowd and announced that the Bavarian government was deposed. He took Kahr, General Otto von Lossow, and the police chief Hans Ritter von Seisser into a back room and demanded that they join his march on Berlin. Ludendorff appeared. The three Bavarian leaders, intimidated, declared their support. But Carr and his colleagues, once outside the brewery, immediately retracted their adhesion and alerted the army, police and media. At noon on November 9th, Hitler and Ludendorff marched with about 2,000 armed men into the center of Munich. In the Feldherrnhalle, the Marshal's Lodge, one of the most emblematic monuments of the city, they found a police cordon. Someone fired. In the exchange of fire that lasted about half a minute, 14 protesters and 4 police officers were killed. Hermann Göring was wounded in the leg. Hitler was knocked to the ground, his shoulder dislocated. Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, one of his closest collaborators, died at his side. The putsch had failed miserably in less than 24 hours, but what happened next was even more telling than the coup itself. Hitler was arrested and prosecuted. The court appointed for the case was a favorite of the Bavarian government. The judge, Georg Neithardt, was a well-known nationalist. Hitler was allowed to appear in civilian clothes wearing his Iron Cross and to speak in court for hours without interruption. "The eternal tribunal of history," he declared, "will judge us as Germans who wanted the best for their people." The sentence was 5 years in prison, the minimum sentence for high treason, with the possibility of parole before 6 months. Ludendorff was acquitted. Hitler spent 9 months in Landsberg am Lech, in a comfortable cell with its own furniture and access to visitors. More than 500 people visited him. He received flowers, gifts, and letters from admirers. And in those 9 months, he dictated to his assistant Rudolf Hess the manuscript of Mein Kampf, in which he set out with total clarity what he intended to do: destroy the Jews, conquer living space in the East, establish a racially pure state under his absolute leadership. The book was all there for anyone who wanted to read it. The political conclusion Hitler drew from the November failure was simple. Seizing power by force alone was not possible without the support of the army and state elites. Next time he would need to win over those elites before acting. Next time I would use elections as well. But for that to work, it needed a big enough crisis. The next crisis would come 6 years later, and it would be global. On October 24, 1929, the New York stock markets crashed. Black Thursday was followed by Black Monday, and after weeks of free fall, on October 29th, the day that went down in history as Black Tuesday, 16.4 million shares were sold on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day. $10 billion, a figure that was inconceivable at the time, were wiped out of the market value in hours. The American financial collapse spread through the world like a fire through a dry field. German financial institutions, which had borrowed massively on international markets during the relatively stable years 1924 to 1929 under the Dawes Plan agreements, suddenly saw American creditors demand the repayment of their loans. Credit dried up. Companies could not finance their production. Factories closed. The workers were fired. The number of unemployed in Germany rose from just over 1 million at the end of 1929 to more than 3 million by the end of 1930, 4 million in 1931, and more than 6 million in the winter of 1932. That was official unemployment. The real one, counting the underemployed, short-time workers and those who had given up looking for work, was much higher. In some industrial cities in the Ruhr and Saxony, 1 in 3 workers was unemployed. The government of the Social Democrat Hermann Müller, a grand coalition of 5 parties, collapsed in March 1930, just as the Depression was beginning. The breaking point was the question of whether to increase or cut unemployment benefits, a debate that today sounds ironically small given the magnitude of what was to come. President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning of the Catholic Centre Party as Chancellor, with an implicit mandate to govern as far as possible without Parliament, using the emergency powers of Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. Brüning chose austerity. He cut spending, increased taxes, reduced civil servants' salaries and social benefits. It was the economic orthodoxy of the time, the same one applied by Great Britain, the United States, and most developed countries. And as happened everywhere, the recipe did not work. It deepened the recession instead of fighting it. And in that climate of desperation, the Nazis held the Reichstag elections of September 14, 1930. The result left all of Germany, and much of Europe, paralyzed. The NSDAP went from 12 deputies and 810,000 votes in 1928 to 107 deputies and 6.4 million votes. From being a marginal party of fanatics, it had become the second most voted party in the country. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on September 15th, "An incredible advance. I didn't expect it like this." Who voted for the Nazis? Subsequent historical research, including Richard Evans's analysis, shows a clear profile: the Protestant middle class. Small merchants ruined by depression and terrified by the possibility of falling into the working class, farmers crushed by the collapse of agricultural prices. Civil servants and employees who had lost their savings in the hyperinflation of 1923 now saw their jobs threatened. University students who feared they would not find work when they finished their studies. The industrial workers voted overwhelmingly for the SPD or the KPD. The workers who were still employed in September 1930 did not bet on the Nazis. But those who had already lost faith in the traditional parties, those who were looking for a radical alternative other than Soviet communism, those who wanted someone who would promise them order, bread, and national greatness, those voted for Hitler. And the NSDAP gave them what they wanted, not in the form of a detailed economic program. The party's program was an incoherent mixture of anti-capitalist populism and racial nationalism. What it gave them was something more valuable: the feeling that their sufferings had an identified culprit: the Jews, the socialists, the November criminals, those who had signed Versailles, those who managed the banks that ruined the farmers, those who filled the cabarets of Berlin while honest Germans could not buy bread. Nazi propaganda, directed by Joseph Goebbels from the late 1920s, was of extraordinary sophistication for the time. They used cinema, radio, posters, mass rallies with quasi-religious symbolism. The NSDAP organized more campaign events in 1932 than any other party in German history up to that point. Hitler flew from city to city, a device that was novel at the time, and emphasized his image of modernity and dynamism with his Hitler over Germany campaign. The streets, meanwhile, became battlefields. The SA brownshirts clashed every week with the communist militias of the Red Front, with the Social Democratic Guards of the Reichsbanner, with the police. In the first 7 months of 1932, in Prussia alone, there were 461 political riots with 400 wounded and 82 killed. In July 1932, 105 of the 155 people killed in political clashes in Prussia fell during the weeks of the election campaign. Violence was the means and the message at the same time. In July 1932, the NSDAP reached its electoral peak with 13.7 million votes, 37.4% of the total, and 230 deputies. It was the most voted party in Germany. But he did not have an absolute majority, and President Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. In November 1932, a second election, the Nazis lost 2 million votes. The party's accounts were almost bankrupt after 2 massive election campaigns in a few months. Gregor Strasser, the party's number 2, and the man who most understood the real economic problems, entered into talks with Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher about the possibility of the Nazis participating in a coalition government. Hitler angrily vetoed him and expelled Strasser from the party. Schleicher tried to create a coalition of transversality, a government that included the trade union wing of the Social Democratic Party and the more moderate Nazis. He failed. Franz von Papen, the elegant and deeply arrogant former chancellor who had Hindenburg's ear, convinced the aging president that Hitler could be controlled, that the appointment of Hitler as chancellor, with only 2 Nazi ministers in a mostly conservative cabinet, would be the way to tame the movement. On January 30th, 1933, at 11:30 in the morning, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Reich Chancellor in the office of President Hindenburg. Papen was appointed vice-chancellor, confident that he would keep Hitler in check. "In 2 months, we will have cornered Hitler in a corner that will weep," Papen told a friend that afternoon. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern political history. The night of February 27, 1933, was cold in Berlin with temperatures below zero. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Marinus van der Lubbe, a 24-year-old Dutchman almost blind from a work accident, who had travelled to Germany convinced that the workers' movement needed spectacular action, entered the Reichstag building through a rear window. He had matches and flammable material in his backpack. First, he tried to set fire to the restaurant, without success. Then he found his way to the session room, where the curtains and wood upholstery caught on easily. The building's massive glass dome acted as a chimney, fanning the flames upwards. Van der Lubbe was captured inside the burning building by the Reichstag's own employees. Firefighters arrived quickly but were unable to save the session room. When Hitler, Goering and Goebbels arrived at the scene, the building was burning. Rudolf Diels, the non-Nazi head of the Prussian political police, found van der Lubbe already under interrogation, his torso naked and sweaty. A savage triumph shone in the eyes of the pale and emaciated young face. Diels came to the conclusion, correct as later research confirmed, that the man had acted alone. But that conclusion was politically unusable. Hitler, according to Diels's testimony, was visibly excited, his face red with excitement and the heat that accumulated under the dome. He cried out, "There will be no more mercy. Everyone who stands in our way will be eliminated. The communist deputies must be hanged this very night. Anyone who is in collusion with the communists must be arrested." The next morning, February 28th, the Reich cabinet passed the Reichstag fire decree, the decree for the protection of the people and the state, which suspended the constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech, press, assembly, and correspondence, and allowed for preventive detention without a warrant for an indefinite period of time. Hindenburg signed it that same day. Within hours, the police began mass arrests. 4,000 communists were arrested in the first few days. In Rhénanie and the Ruhr, 8,000 communists were arrested in March and April alone. The Communist Party, which had won 81 deputies in the November 1932 elections, was crushed. Its deputies elected in the March 5th elections, because the party was able to run, even though it knew its candidates would never be sworn in, were arrested as soon as police located them. The elections of March 5th, 1933 were not free. There were brown shirts patrolling polling stations, opponents intimidated, media outlets under partial control of Goebbels's newly created Ministry of Propaganda. But neither were they a total farce. The NSDAP won 43.9% of the vote. It was not the absolute majority they wanted, but with their allies in the German National Party, DNVP, they had enough for the next maneuvers. On March 23, 1933, with the communist deputies arrested and the Social Democrats physically threatened by the brown shirts stationed outside the Berlin Kroll Opera House, where the Reichstag was provisionally in session, the parliament passed the enabling law, Ermächtigungsgesetz. It gave Hitler's government powers to legislate by decree for 4 years, without the need for parliamentary approval, even if the laws violated the constitution. 2/3 of the votes were needed for this. He got them. The Social Democratic Party, with 94 deputies, voted against it in its entirety. All the other parties voted in favor. In a brutal speech, its leader Otto Wels, knowing that he and his colleagues would likely be arrested on leaving the building, declared, "The Constitution does not give us the freedom to suppress civil rights. The gentlemen of the National Socialist majority cannot rob the Social Democrats of their decency. We are defenseless, but not without honor." The Enabling Act made Hitler a legal dictator. In the months that followed, the unions were dissolved, their offices stormed by the SA on May 2, 1933, the day after the Great Labor Day parade in which Hitler had celebrated German workers. Political parties were banned one by one. The NSDAP declared itself the only legal party in Germany on July 14, 1933. The Länder were coordinated, gleichgeschaltet, under the control of the central government. The press was placed under the supervision of the Ministry of Propaganda. Germany had become a one-party dictatorship within 6 months. And it had happened in large part with the complicity or passivity of the institutions that should have prevented it. There is a narrative about the Nazi economy that is widely circulated and that, in its simplicity, hides the most important thing. It goes like this. Hitler took power with 6 million unemployed and eliminated them in 4 years. He built the autobahns, reduced unemployment, revitalized German industry. Whatever the political price, Hitler's economic miracle was real. Adam Tooze, in The Wages of Destruction, methodically dismantles that narrative. The first week after his appointment as Chancellor, on February 1, 1933, Hitler spoke on his first national radio broadcast and promised to fight unemployment. 2 days later, in a secret meeting with the High Command of the Army, he explained with total clarity what really mattered to him: rearming. The future of Germany depends exclusively and solely on the reconstruction of the Wehrmacht. All other tasks must give priority to military reconstruction. In all cases where there is a conflict between the demands of the Wehrmacht and the demands of other purposes, the interests of the Wehrmacht must have absolute priority in all cases. On June 8, 1933, at the same cabinet meeting at which Germany announced its unilateral moratorium on foreign debt, Hitler approved a secret rearmament program of 35 billion marks to be spent over 8 years, a figure that represented between 5 and 10% of Germany's annual GDP for the next decade. For comparison, the Weimar Republic's total military expenditure in its best years was measured in hundreds of millions of marks, not billions. The financing of this program was a work of financial engineering with deliberately obscure elements. Hjalmar Schacht, the financial genius whom Hitler appointed president of the Reichsbank in March 1933, created the so-called MEFO notes, promissory notes issued in the name of a shell company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft GmbH, founded with barely 1 million marks of capital contributed by Krupp, Siemens, Vereinigte Stahlwerke and other large arms industries. Contractors working for rearmament received MEFO-Wechsel, which they could discount at the Reichsbank. The Reichsbank ended up having the promissory notes. Military spending was left out of the official budget. Between 1934 and 1938, MEFO banknotes worth 12 billion marks were issued, more than half of the military spending of those years. And unemployment. The first civilian program for job creation, the Reinhard program, adopted on 28 May 1933, was 1,000 million marks. Compared to the 35,000 million of the rearmament, it was a detail. The famous autobahns, which Nazi propaganda presented as the solution to unemployment, never employed more than 38,000 workers at their peak of activity. The rearmament employed hundreds of thousands. The reduction in unemployment was real. By the end of 1935, Germany had returned to almost full employment. But the mechanisms were different from what the propaganda said. An important part was rearmament itself. Armament factories, shipyards, war materials, industries created millions of jobs. Another part was the natural recovery of the global economy, which also occurred in other countries without any Nazi government promoting it. And one part was the expulsion of Jews, women and political opponents from the labor market, which statistically reduced unemployment in a way that was not counted in official figures. For the average German citizen, the Nazi economy offered work and order. Wages were lower in real terms than in 1929. Private consumption, as Tooze shows with precise data, did not recover its levels of 1928 until the end of the 1930s. The recovery was fundamentally a recovery of state spending, not the well-being of German families. But the work existed, and compared to the 6 million unemployed in 1932, that seemed like a miracle. What the propaganda never mentioned was the hidden cost. Schacht imposed from 1934 an import control system so severe that it reduced German access to textile raw materials by more than 80% compared to 1928 levels. Saxony and Baden, regions dependent on the export of textiles and consumer goods, experienced a partial recovery at best. In 1934, the price of clothing in Germany rose more than in any other sector of the economy because the state allowed such controlled inflation to reduce domestic consumption of imports. Confidential Gestapo reports on the popular mood in the autumn of 1934 described an apathetic, tense population complaining about the price of food and the scarcity of fabric, making bitter jokes about frozen wages. In Dortmund, workers had begun to greet each other not with the official Heil Hitler, but with ironic Heil 3.50 Reichsmarks, the daily wage of many construction workers. The Nazi economic miracle was, to a large extent, a miracle of armaments that was presented as a miracle of well-being. The difference mattered, although at first few saw it. That is why in 1939, when the war came, the German economy was not the perfectly tuned machine that the propaganda described. It was an economy in a perpetual state of tension, which could only be sustained by moving forward, conquering new sources of raw materials, new captive markets, new forced laborers. The war was not simply the result of Hitler's ideology. It was also the logical consequence of an economy that had been built to wage war, that could not survive without it, and that knew it from the beginning. Nazi anti-Semitism was not improvised or spontaneous. It was a coherent policy implemented in stages, with written instructions, responsible officials, and internal discussions about pace and scope. The first attacks on German Jews began immediately after the seizure of power. In the first week of March 1933, even before the Enabling Act made Hitler a legal dictator, the SA raided Jewish lawyers' offices, pushed judges out of the courts, broke into shops, and beat the owners. On April 1, 1933, the government officially organized a boycott of Jewish businesses throughout the Reich. Signs on the doors, SA guards preventing customers from entering. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 institutionalized discrimination. Jews lost German citizenship, marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans were banned. Complicated racial classifications were set at who was Jewish, semi-Jewish, or Fourth Jew. Racial apartheid was codified in law. What the Nuremberg laws codified was not only exclusion, it was also the definition, because before those laws, the category of Jew was fluid, cultural, religious. Then it was biological and legal. A man who had abandoned the Jewish faith 2 generations ago, who had converted to Protestantism, who bore a 4-syllable German surname and had never entered a synagogue, could be classified as a Jew if his grandparents had been Jewish. The Reich bureaucracy produced genealogy forms, demanded documentary proof of ancestry, created entire departments dedicated to tracing family trees to determine the degree of racial impurity. German administrative modernity, its tradition of rigorous civil registries, its bureaucratic efficiency, became an instrument of persecution of unprecedented historical precision. But the Nazi Party elites were divided over speed. There was a constant tension between those who wanted to act more quickly, such as Heinrich Himmler, who built the SS apparatus of terror, and those who feared the economic consequences of anti-Semitism. As Tooze accurately documents, the Reichsbank calculated that the mass emigration of German Jews would consume foreign currency that the regime could not afford to lose. In 1933 and 1934, the Reichsbank's foreign exchange reserves were on the verge of collapse. Each Jewish family that emigrated took money that the central bank desperately needed. The economic policy of the regime and its racial policy clashed at this point with a contradiction that no official satisfactorily resolved. Between January 1933 and June 1935, according to figures from the Reichsbank itself, capital transfers linked to Jewish emigration cost the central bank 132 million marks in foreign currency, of which 124.8 million corresponded specifically to Jewish emigrants. In the months of greatest transfer, October 1933, the flow reached 11 million marks per month, with total reserves that in the summer of 1934 fell below 100 million marks, enough to cover barely a week of minimal imports. The regime found itself in the Kafkaesque situation of wanting to get rid of German Jews, but not being able to afford their departure. The result was a policy of forced emigration that at the same time censored itself economically. By 1934, Jewish emigration had fallen to 23,000 people, in 1935 to 21,000. The tax on the flight of capital, the Reichsfluchtsteuer, was tightened and its threshold lowered from 200,000 to 50,000 marks, making it practically impossible for any middle-class family to leave with assets. The result was a policy of forced emigration that at the same time censored itself economically. The Havara Transfer, an agreement between the Nazi regime and Zionist organizations in Palestine that allowed emigrants to bring money in the form of German exports of goods to Palestine, was the partial solution, allowing some 50,000 Jews to emigrate between 1933 and 1941, rescuing some of their heritage. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, was a qualitative leap. In response to the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Polish Jew whose family had been deported, the SA and SS organized coordinated pogroms throughout Germany and Austria. More than 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed, their windows smashed, hence the name. About 1,400 synagogues were burned or destroyed. Approximately 91 Jews died that night, hundreds more in the days that followed. More than 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald. The Nazis' name for the night, Kristallnacht, was both euphemistic and dismissive, a way of trivializing what had actually been the greatest pogrom in Western Europe since the Middle Ages. And what followed Kristallnacht showed how the institutional machinery of hatred worked. Hermann Göring convened a meeting of ministers and officials on November 12, 1938, to coordinate the economic response. The result was a collective fine of 1 billion marks imposed on the German Jewish community for damage caused by the Nazis themselves to Jewish property. In addition, German insurance companies covering Jewish businesses were instructed to pay compensation to the state, not to the injured owners. The state kept the money. The victims paid for having been victimized. It was a legal perversion so perfectly executed that it required weeks of preparatory bureaucratic work. By January 1939, Hitler pronounced in the Reichstag a prophecy that he then repeatedly invoked. If international financial jury, inside and outside Europe, succeeds in plunging the peoples back into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and with it the victory of Judaism, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. What remained to be seen was whether those words were rhetoric or program. The answer came during the war. Here is the core of the question that opens this script. All that history, the empire built on blood, the defeat of 1918, Versailles, hyperinflation, the Great Depression, the myth of the Dolchstoß, explains how Nazism came to power. But he does not answer why the Germans accepted it, why they didn't resist any longer, why so many, engineers, doctors, judges, teachers, civil servants, actively participated or looked the other way. The historical research of the last few decades and the synthesis offered by historians such as Richard Evans and Ian Kershaw points to several overlapping answers. The first is fear. The Nazi terror apparatus, the SA in the streets, the Gestapo, the concentration camps that everyone knew existed even if they didn't know exactly what was going on inside, created an atmosphere of real intimidation. Expressing opposition was dangerous. Not doing so was safer. The second is partial ideological consent. A majority of Germans did not share the virulent anti-Semitism of the Nazis, but they did share nationalism, resentment against Versailles, anti-communism. Hitler eliminated unemployment. or so it seemed. He re-established conscription without France responding. He remilitarized the Rhine in 1936 without consequences. He incorporated Austria in 1938, the Anschluss that Versailles had banned, amid scenes of jubilation in Vienna and Berlin, and then the Sudetenland, the German-speaking Czechoslovak region, with the humiliating blessing of France and Britain in Munich in September 1938. Each triumph reinforced Hitler's image as the man who had restored Germany to its greatness. The third is the gradual disintegration of moral categories. Holocaust historians have documented how the perpetrators of the worst atrocities were not, for the most part, sadists who had waited their entire lives for the opportunity to kill. They were ordinary men, civil servants, policemen, soldiers, who had adapted step by step to an environment in which the murder of civilians was presented as a patriotic and professional duty. Each small step, accepting a promotion, signing an order, looking the other way, made the next step easier. And the fourth is the most uncomfortable: Hitler's real popularity among the German population during much of his rule. It was not universal. He was not unconditional. Many Germans cherished it as a national and political symbol and distanced themselves from its most extreme anti-Semitism. But Gestapo opinion polls, which monitored the popular mood with remarkable accuracy, show that until at least 1941, and in some quarters as far as Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, Hitler enjoyed a level of popular support that no democratic leader had achieved during the Weimar Republic. The war did not begin on September 1, 1939. It began earlier, in the decisions made in the offices of the Wilhelmstrasse from the first days of the Nazi government. On October 14, 1933, 9 months after taking power, Hitler announced Germany's withdrawal from the Geneva Conference on Disarmament and the League of Nations. It was not an impromptu decision. It was the first step in the deliberate break with the international order established at Versailles. General Werner von Blomberg and Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath backed the decision. In Berlin, some officials expected a military reaction from France or Poland. They prepared emergency plans to defend Berlin in the event of an invasion. There were none. In March 1935, Hitler announced the reinstatement of conscription and the official creation of the Luftwaffe, the air force that had been building in secret since 1933, direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain formally protested. Nothing more. In March 1936, German troops entered the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, which the Treaty of Versailles had created as a buffer zone between Germany and France. It was a risky gamble. If France had mobilized its army, the German troops had orders to withdraw. The French army did not move. Hitler had gambled and won. The lesson was recorded. Western democracies would not fight. In March 1938, the Anschluss with Austria. In September 1938, the Munich Accords, in which Britain and France agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise to have no more territorial claims. Neville Chamberlain returned to London waving the paper of the agreement, "Peace in our time." But on March 15, 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, non-German territory, Bohemia and Moravia, proving that Hitler's promises were worthless. France and Britain did not act militarily, but extended security guarantees to Poland. On August 23, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow and signed with Vyacheslav Molotov a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The public document was a treaty of neutrality. The secret protocol, which would not be made public until decades later, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic countries, Finland, and the eastern half of Poland would fall into the Soviet sphere, the western half of Poland in the German one. Stalin accepted because he thought that this would keep him out of the war. Hitler agreed because without the pact, invading Poland meant risking a war on two fronts from day one. On September 1, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the German Navy, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, opened fire on the Polish garrison of the Westerplatte in the port of Danzig, while 1,800,000 German troops crossed the Polish border at 3 different points. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields and cities. It was the Blitzkrieg, in its first large-scale application. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. We return to the question at the beginning, why Germany? The answer that emerges from this complex story has several levels that cannot be separated. The first is structural. The German Empire built a political culture in which force was legitimate, in which the internal enemy was a normal category of political discourse, in which the military operated autonomously from civilian government, and institutional loyalty to democracy was superficial or non-existent. The second is historic. The defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles and the legend of the Dolchstoss created a national resentment that the Weimar democratic parties were unable to channel. The defenders of the Republic had to defend at the same time the peace and the treaty that almost all Germans hated. It was an impossible contradiction. The third is economic. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the savings of the middle class. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 destroyed their jobs. Two economic catastrophes in 10 years, both under democratic governments, convinced millions of Germans that democracy was synonymous with chaos and misery. The fourth is political. The lack of strong centre-right parties that could absorb the protest vote left that space available for the NSDAP. The conservatives who thought they could control Hitler, von Papen, Hindenburg, the Ruhr industrialists, made the fatal mistake of underestimating how far he was willing to go. And the fifth is leadership. Hitler was a politician with an extraordinary talent for understanding collective emotions and exploiting them. His anti-Semitism was not the cause of his political success. It would be too simple. Rather, it was an ingredient of a larger message that promised to restore German greatness, identify the culprits of all suffering, and offer a future of order and power after years of humiliation and chaos. None of this was inevitable. Evans points it out explicitly. Until the first months of 1933, the rise of the Nazis to power was not a predetermined conclusion. There were junctures in which history could have taken another path. If only the Great Depression had been less devastating. If Hindenburg had rejected Papen's advice. If only the parties of the centre-left had formed a united front earlier. If the army had intervened. But they didn't. And that's what makes the story so disturbing. Germany was seen as the enemy of World War II because Germany, not a demon from the sky, but a set of decisions made by real people in real circumstances, chose to be what it was. The great lesson is not that the Germans were a particularly evil people. The great lesson is how many ordinary things had to go wrong, how many institutions had to fail, how many individuals had to look the other way or applaud for something like this to be possible in one of the most cultured and developed countries in the world. That's the hardest truth, and it is the one that should never be forgotten.